Welcome. As always, only 3 mid-roll ads in this video. One after story number 1, one after story number 2, and one more after story number 3. After that, the rest of the video will be ad-free. If you enjoy, please subscribe and hit the thumbs up. It really helps out my channel very much. Now, let's begin. So this event took place over 10 years ago, back when I was 13. Now before I get into it, I should let you know that I have a very overprotective mother, like textbook overprotectiveness. Something she often did was come into my room at different times throughout the night to check on me. It's something I actually really disliked because I'm a light sleeper and I also scare extremely easily. So most of the time when she came to check up on me, she'd either wake me up or scare the crap out of me. Now one night I was turning in for bed. All I know is that it was a weeknight because I had school the next day. The TV was on and I always left it on because it helped me sleep. I had pulled my covers over my head as I like to sleep in a cocoon-like fashion. I had just closed my eyes when I could hear footsteps from outside my door. I sighed and get out of my blanket cocoon, knowing that at any moment my mother was going to enter the room to check up on me. I sat up in my bed waiting, so at least this way she wouldn't scare me. I wait for about a minute or so, and my mother doesn't come in, but I can still hear her footsteps, which confused me. I continue to listen as I hear her go back and forth, just pacing. What is she doing? I thought to myself. There was no reason for her to go past my room, nor pace in front of it. The only thing past my room was my sister's bedroom, but she had long since moved out, so I couldn't fathom any reason why my mother would just be going back and forth in front of my door. So I finally get out of bed and open up my door to ask my mother what in the world she was doing. But when I opened the door, I found nothing. This puzzled me even more as I look up and down the hallway, and still, no Mom. There's no way I could have missed her. And I think maybe it was possible she was playing a prank on me, something my family sometimes does. So I make my way across the house to my mother's room, and I pause when I see her calmly laying in her bed. It became clear that she hadn't been messing with me. If so, there's no way she would have been able to make it back to her room without me seeing her unless she had run back. She looked too calm, and her breathing was too relaxed to imply that she had been running at any point. I walk over to her bed, and she must have heard me, 'cause she rolled over to face me. She asked me what was wrong, and I asked her if she had been over to my room to check up on me. She said no, and I really wish she hadn't. I don't know what face I was making, but it was clear by the way my mother's expression changed that she sensed something was very wrong. But she didn't press on the matter, and instead let me go back to my room. I almost ran back to my room, now scared, and immediately shut the door and dived back into my bed. I do my best to brush the whole thing off as my imagination playing tricks on me, and I get back under my covers, attempting to go back to sleep. I shut my eyes tightly and lay still. It only felt like a few seconds go by before I hear the footsteps again. I sit back up, throwing the covers off, and turn off my TV, hoping that the old thing was just making odd noises. Well, that didn't work, and it just made the sounds of the footsteps even louder. Although now I'm scared out of my mind, I make my way back over to the door and open it. Once again, finding the hallway empty and dark. I quickly step out to the hallway and turn on the light before going back into my room. In my mind, the light will keep away whatever was there. But that wasn't the case. I get back in my bed and sit, just watching the door. And that's when it happens. My heart stops when I see a shadow slowly pass by under the crack of my door. I remember all the air leaving my lungs and just the absolute terror I felt at that moment. I had no clue as to what I could do. All I know is I just wanted to keep whoever it was out. For the rest of the night, I just sat on my bed my knees pulled up to my chest, just watching whoever it was walk back and forth. I didn't know how nor when, but I had fallen asleep at one point and awoke the next morning extremely tired. I told my mom what had happened, and while she did listen and pay attention to my worries, seeing as there was nothing she could do, it was brushed off. She did tell me if this happened again, and if I was too scared to sleep in my room, I could come to her room and sleep there. For the next few days, I slept with my door locked, but the mysterious footsteps never happened again. To this day, I have no clue who or what it was. A spirit? An intruder? Seeing as they didn't harm me and just scared me, I don't think it was malevolent, but I'd still really like to know what or who it was and why they were there. This incident happened to me when I was 20 years old. I've always been an outwardly alternative person, but I am known to be notoriously friendly and loud. I am not the kind of girl you would think people would want to try anything with. This is not to say I'm ugly. I've always thought of myself as average. Black hair, coffee eyes, pale skin. The catch here is that I was very heavily into thrash metal at the time, so even though I am on the shorter side, I would wear flipped bill trucker hats, ripped jean jackets with patches and studs, and if you saw me at the shows, I was in the mosh pit, throwing punches. I wasn't dating at the time, but I was talking consistently to a guy that I liked. At the time, I enjoyed taking nightly evening walks around my neighborhood, a semi-nice middle-income area that my parents had managed to move us to after lots of overtime and a lawsuit at my father's work that ended up paying out. I had made friends in the neighborhood, and it wasn't uncommon for me to show up unannounced at a friend's house and play some Mario Kart, or maybe smoke. After an uneventful visit to my friend's house, seeing as they weren't home, I decided to walk the long stretch of golf course. I just didn't want to be home yet. So I'm walking, listening to Slayer on my earphones, when I notice that a black Range Rover has been crawling by just a little behind where I was walking. I figured they were checking out the golf course, maybe trying to get a look at the size of it, but a car horn honks behind the Range Rover, and they are forced to drive forward. Oblivious, I continue my walk until I notice the Range Rover has made a U-turn to crawl behind me again. He circles maybe 2 more times. I take one earphone out and look at the car. The driver kind of freaks out at being noticed and drives forward again. So you know the feeling you get when you know something isn't right? Well, it finally hit me, and I start speed walking to the liquor store. I duck into the store, shooting the owner a quick head nod of acknowledgement, because we knew each other fairly well at this point. That's when I hear a car door outside being closed, and I see a guy walking towards the liquor store. It's the guy in the Range Rover. I tell the owner that I need to use the bathroom, an employee-only sort of deal, and he begrudgingly obliges me. I get to the bathroom, which provides a good view of the store, and just listen with the door cracked and the lights off, so I can see out. The guy walks in. I have never seen him before. He was about my age, tall, dark hair, blue eyes. He then proceeds to tell the owner of the store that he's looking for his little sister, that she's run away from home, and his parents are worried sick, that she'll probably fight back if he approaches her, and doesn't want to alert her to his presence. He then describes me in detail from my custom jean jacket, to my beat-up Nikes, to my mirrored aviators and identifiable facial features. I get a sick feeling in my stomach. Who is this guy? I have never seen him in my life. He leaves the store when the owner says no, and the guy walks back to his car, scanning the entire parking lot, and I hear the car start up and pull out. I emerge from my hiding place and look at the owner, who stares back at me to confirm that we were both kind of weirded out. Looking at him, I quietly say, "That guy is not my brother." I'm not sure what he wanted from me and why he made up an elaborate story, but I have come to the conclusion It can't have been anything good. This messed me up for a while, and I'm still not completely okay, but it's easier to cope. It was the middle of summer, and my parents had left for the weekend to go to our house in Cape Cod. It's about a 2-hour drive away, so it's no big deal for them to leave me alone for a few days. My mom had made some pulled pork and pasta for me to heat up to eat whenever, and I had some money if I wanted to order a pizza. Things were all good. The first night I was alone, I stayed up until 3 in the morning, playing Xbox, so I woke up really late the next day. I checked my phone when I woke up, and saw it was a little past 1. I had made some plans to play some street hockey with my friends at 3, so I threw myself out of bed and stumbled into the shower. I take really long showers. I was in there for about 45 minutes on my phone, scrolling through Reddit and Twitter and whatnot, when I heard my front door open. The bathroom is directly up the stairs from the front door, and the door is pretty loud when it opens and closes. I immediately froze, since obviously I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes, ears trained in trying to hear anything else. Nothing. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe my parents were home early, so I turned off the shower, wrapped my towel around myself, and slowly walked down the stairs. I can't see into the kitchen when I walk down the stairs. My house was really old, so each step on the stairs made a super loud creak noise. I still took my time and tried to be as quiet as possible. I probably took about 45 seconds to walk down the stairs, so when I get to the second to the last stair, right before I could see around the corner into the kitchen, I take a little breath to compose myself. In my mind, I knew I was being stupid. There obviously wasn't anything in the kitchen. There's no way I wouldn't have heard another noise. And there's no reason for them to still be in the kitchen, even if there were burglars or something in the house. After sort of mentally chastising myself for being such a wuss, I sort of chuckled to myself for being so stupid, and just normally walked the last 2 stairs, and turned the corner into the kitchen. Standing about 2 feet away from me in the middle of my kitchen is a man staring straight at me, perfectly still, with a massive smile across his face, just staring at me. The thing I remember most vividly wasn't his face or his smile, but his arms. They weren't just at his side. He held them in the strangest, most abnormal position I've ever seen. They were where one would normally hold their arms, but he had rotated them to the point where they were almost completely reversed, as well as lifting them up and a little behind himself. I don't know why I remember this so much, but it's just the weirdest position that I've ever seen somebody hold their arms. Honestly, I thought I almost had a heart attack right there. Looking back, I can realize how creepy the situation was, but in the moment, I just took a step towards him and punched him as hard as I could in the jaw. The second I connected, I beelined up the stairs, dropping my towel in the kitchen with my heart beating out of control. I sprinted into my room and locked the door behind me. I quickly put a chair up against the doorknob. Almost without thinking, I called 911. And nearly in tears, told the operator what happened. As I sat on the floor of my room, in practically the fetal position, staring at the door, praying that a cop would be here soon, I noticed the light coming from the gap between my door had stopped. The man was standing on the other side of the door. There's no words to describe the feeling I had. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the shadow across the bottom of the door shift in tiny ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, praying the man would go away for what seemed like an hour. All the while the 911 operator was asking, "Hello? Sir? Sir, are you there? Hello?" I didn't want to make a noise, and even if I wanted to move my arms to bring the phone to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually the light returned to the gap, and I heard the faintest of footsteps, slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes, as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak. I heard banging on the front door, and the sound of 2 officers entering my house. I finally felt safe, and I opened the door to the 2 of them standing there. I almost cried. Nowadays, my parents don't even leave me home alone, which I honestly don't mind, and I check every lock in the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still. But I'm doing alright. Even working with sketch artists in a few lineups, the police never found who was in my house. It sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside, half expecting to see him standing across the street, smiling under a lamppost. I have no idea what he wanted or who he was, but regardless, I hope I never see him again, and I'm still afraid that someday he might come back. So this story is going to be partly from my perspective as well as my brother's perspective. This is a true story that happened last night while I was at my grandma's house. So before this all took place, I went to McDonald's in the nearest city to us, which is about 20 minutes away. After that, I decided to go down to my grandma's house instead of going straight home. For context, she lives down a long farm road, to which you also have to turn off down a half-mile dirt driveway just to get to her house. I arrived there at around 9 p.m., and I went in and visited with my grandmother and my brother, who lives with her, ever since my grandma passed away, so that she wouldn't have to live down there alone. My brother and I took out my grandma's dog to pee around 10:30 p.m., and we just sat outside listening to music and talked for a while. At that point, I was starting to get cold because this is East Texas, and I am not used to it getting down into the low 40s at night, so I was about ready to head inside. I noticed something moving in the corner of my eye near the large metal shop that sits a few hundred yards from the house. I didn't really take too much notice though, because it is not uncommon for deer or raccoons to come snooping around in the yard, and plus, my grandma's dog wasn't barking, so I thought that it might have just been my eyes playing tricks on me. We finally headed back inside, and my grandma went to sleep at around 11 p.m. So me and my brother stayed up and played Among Us and watched YouTube for a while. At around 2:30 a.m., I was very tired and ready to go home, so I asked my brother to walk with me to the door and make sure that I get to my car, because I am always very paranoid, especially at night. He joked around and said that he would turn the light off on me and lock the door, and I freaked out and begged him to walk me to the car, to which he finally humored me. I got in my car and immediately locked the doors as I was driving off back down the dirt road. I got home within 10 minutes and fixed myself some ice cream before I sat down and enjoyed some creepy, scary stories on YouTube. Another 15 or so minutes passed, and I got a FaceTime call from my brother, to which I picked up almost immediately. I could tell that he was freaked out about something, but he wasn't saying anything right away, so I asked him what was wrong. The following is my best attempt to paraphrase what my brother told me. He said that after I left, he went back outside to listen to some music and sit on the porch. He had the music on his phone up pretty loud, which would usually mask any noises of animals coming from the nearby woods. After a few minutes of listening to music, he said that he heard what he thought to be sounds of metal banging around, so he quickly paused the music and listened to see if he could hear the sound again. He stood up and looked towards the shop and the boat shed, which are adjacent to each other and are a few hundred yards away from where he was standing. He saw a faint light shining around near the boat shed, but then it quickly flicked off. At this point, he was freaking out, so he quietly crept back inside the house and locked the door behind him. He said that he ran to his room in the back of the house, I guess not thinking to wake up our grandma. He grabbed a weapon and quickly ran back outside. He saw the glow of a flashlight move around. He walked out to the edge of the concrete carport and stared out towards the boat shed. The only thing illuminating the boat shed was the faint light coming from the house. He said that he tried to muster up the most intimidating voice he could manage and said, "Who is out there?" To which there was no immediate reply, except for a slight bumping sound, which solidified the fact that someone was indeed there. Now keep in mind, this is out in the middle of the country, in a town with a population of just over 1,000 people, and the nearest house is across the lake, or miles down the farm road. so no well-meaning person would just happen to stumble across my grandma's house this late at night. Also, my grandma has had problems with people snooping around the property in the past, so this is not something any of us take lightly. And for the life of me, I can't tell you why my brother didn't call the police. But you also have to remember that there is literally one cop in our entire town, and it is 3 a.m., so it would take at least 30 minutes for the cop to even show up. So my brother again called for the person to show themselves. He said that he saw a tall, lanky figure slowly emerge from the boat shed with a flashlight in hand. Although my brother couldn't see any distinct features about the person, he could definitely tell that it was an older man and that it was no one that we knew. It was especially not anyone that should be in our boat shed at 3 a.m. At this point, he shouted, "Who are you?" The man was still silent and began slowly walking towards him. My brother waved the weapon back and forth and gave one last verbal warning to the man and said, "Tell me who you are now. Why are you here?" The man quickly raised his hands up and said, Whoa, calm down, man," as he continued walking towards my brother. My brother waved the weapon again. The man suddenly took off down the driveway, and my brother screamed, "I wouldn't come back if I were you." My brother then quickly ran inside to wake up my grandma, who had somehow slept through the entire commotion. She didn't seem worried enough to actually call the police, but of course, after hearing this, all I could think was what were the true intentions of that man? Was he just some druggie snooping around, looking to steal some tools for drug money? Or were his intentions much more sinister? Another question that haunts me about this whole situation is how many times has this happened after my grandma and brother went to bed and we just didn't know? And was he watching us from the shadows all night? Was he watching me as I walked out to my car? What would have happened if my brother had actually turned out the lights and locked the door before I could get to my car? Late last year, I had my 21st birthday. Along with celebrating with my friends, my boyfriend's mom wanted to take me out as well. So his mom went ahead and reserved a table at a bar in downtown for Saturday night. Saturday night comes and there's major traffic. His mom and I park in a toll parking lot, and we have to walk about 5 blocks to the bar where we are going to meet my boyfriend and everyone else. So we start walking and arrive at a crosswalk we have to wait at. There's maybe 8 other people standing at this crosswalk with us. I'm just patiently standing there, minding my own business, when suddenly, I noticed this girl standing next to me. She startled me, to be honest. 1, because of how she seemed to appear out of thin air, and 2, because of how close she was standing next to me. It almost felt as if she was trying to huddle into me, like you know when a little kid is shy and will try to hide behind his or her parent. Yeah, that's how she was, except she was just leaning into me, and she had her shoulders hunched over. Her hair was black and long, at least down to her waist. She had a long striped dress that went down to her ankles, a leather jacket, and sandals. She looked to be around my age, but she had dark tan skin and black eyes. Her attire was normal, but she didn't act normal. She was being really weird and kept plugging her nose as if she was smelling something bad, and she kept skittishly looking around as if she expected something to pop out and grab her. To be honest, she was acting like a scared animal, but her demeanor was cold. Her eyes felt like they were dead and empty. Her face held no emotion. So, not liking how close she got to me, I took a few steps to the side. And guess what? She stepped towards me and got as close as she was the first time. What? I sort of thought that was weird, but gave the situation the benefit of the doubt. Plus, the crosswalk light turned green right after she came close to me, so I figured I didn't have to deal with her because we would walk our separate ways. Right? Wrong. She walked across the street and the first few blocks with me, staying the same closeness she was at. No matter where I moved to, no matter how many times she almost got lost in the crowd of people, she would scurry up right next to me again. all the while plugging her nose and looking around everywhere. She made me feel weird. My boyfriend's mom at this point confronted the girl saying, "Hey, do you need something? Or are you okay, or what?" To which the girl responded, "It's not safe." After she said that, she slowly lifted her head, cocked her head slightly, and looked at me dead in the eyes. Her mouth quivered. My boyfriend's mom and I just looked at each other like, what the heck is happening? At that point, I just wanted to get away from this weirdo. It was bad enough she wouldn't stop invading my space and following me, but now she's saying this weird stuff while looking at me? My boyfriend's mom pulls me to her and whispers to me in my ear, "Walk faster and don't look at her. I want to see if she's following us." So that's exactly what I do. And guess what? She follows us all the way to the bar. Despite my boyfriend's mom telling her to please stop, she responded with, "I want to stay with you guys," despite taking unnecessary turns to see if she would turn to follow us. She would. I was freaking out internally all the way there. We finally get to the bar. We whip out our IDs as quickly as we can so we can get inside and get away from this girl following us. You guys, she followed us inside and sat at our table, but she sits at the furthest side of the table, and she starts to scoot herself over, but she only moves over when we look away. You turn your head and boom, she's managed to hop one seat closer to you, and she's just staring the whole time with this blank expression on her face. My boyfriend's mom has had it at this point and gets up to tell the bodyguard to make the girl leave. The bodyguard comes, tells the girl she has to go, and she actually starts to argue with him. I didn't catch the whole conversation over the loud music, but I caught the girl asking him why she had to leave and saying that she can sit anywhere she wanted. She began to get really aggressive once he told her that this table was reserved for us and our group, that she was not a part of. She got all fussy and looked at me with malice before she got up and stormed out. But she didn't leave right away. She stood outside, looking in at me through the open patio at the front of the bar. She wasn't moving and seemed to care less about the hustle and bustle of the people around her. She stood there for about 15 minutes before finally leaving. There was just this really bad and dark feeling that I got from her. She made me really nervous for some reason, and she just felt wrong. She was probably someone just cracked out on drugs, but it was super creepy, and I hope I never see her again. Let me give a little information about me. I am an 18-year-old male. I was 17 at the time of this incident. I have had some weird incidents happen to me throughout my life, but nothing has topped this, and I hope nothing ever does. My parents were having a get-together at our house, which seemed to me like it was dying down. I was getting bored, and I got a text from one of my close friends, Luke, who wanted me to come over. I replied back and said sure. He said that my other friends, Colton, Ryan, and Matthew, are also there, and they were waiting for me. I said I'll be there in 10 minutes. When I got there, I walked in, and I couldn't find anybody. I looked all over the house and found everyone except for Luke. I asked over and over again where he was, and they only told me to go find him. I assumed they were messing with me, so I played along and went to look. Let me give you a layout of his house. He has a relatively long driveway that has a few curves, with a barn on one side and his driveway on the opposite. The house is mainly surrounded by woods and fields. I searched around the house for a while, and they ended up telling me that he was in the barn, so I went outside to the barn. When I walked in, I couldn't hear anything, so I called him. He didn't pick up, so I decided to give up, just as I got a phone call. It was Luke. I picked up and said, "Dude, where are you?" He replied, "I'm running through the backwoods. You have to come find me." I hung up, dreading having to walk through the woods. Why would he come back here, I thought. It's dark, it's cold. It's practically a swamp. I got another phone call. It was Luke. I asked why he would come back there. He only said to come to the tree line. Something sounded really off about his voice, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I told him I was coming, and I walked through the swampy field. That's when I got another phone call. It was my friend Ryan. He said, "Dude, where are you? Did you leave? We're looking for you." I told him I was going to get Luke. What he said next made my heart drop into my stomach. He said that Luke was standing next to him, so I asked him why he called me and said that he was in the woods. Ryan told me that he was in the garage and that his phone was dead. I felt like my heart punched the inside of my stomach as he told me this. I sprinted back to the house as fast as I could. When I got back, Luke charged his phone and showed me there was no recent outgoing call. I have no idea who called me that night, or why they tried to lure me into the woods. Let me start out by saying that when I sleep, I have lucid dreams. When I say this, I mean I make active decisions in my dreams, and I remember my dreams vividly when I wake up, but I don't always realize that I'm dreaming when I'm dreaming. This is the case when the dreams are especially realistic. Because of this, my nightmares become that much more terrifying. One nightmare that I experienced years ago was so surreal that I still cringe when I think about it. It's hard to remember because it was years ago, but it was one of my worst nightmares. It started out in my house. I remember feeling uncomfortable, like if you were about to get on an airplane for the first time and you were afraid of heights. Then, I heard screams from the other rooms in my house. My mom's room and my sister's room. I exited my room to see what was happening. My house was a 2-story, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. All the bedrooms were on the top floor, where mine was the closest to the stairs. Almost the same time I exited my room, I saw a man, whom I did not recognize, exiting my mom's room. He looked at me, and I saw that his face had no emotion. Before I could notice anything else about him, my surroundings changed. I was in a dimly lit street. He was barely visible between the streetlights, and when he came to the light, I finally noticed that he had a scalpel and his face was freckled by spots of blood. Fear swept over my body. I spent the next 3 hours running from him, hiding from him, and banging on vacant homes for help. He always knew where I was. He always caught up to me. I was slower in my dream for whatever reason. I could not escape him. As a quick example, I would hide in a bush or behind a wall. He would walk directly towards where I was hiding, staring directly at me without fail. I would manage an escape before he got too close. Again, he did not have a line of sight, and he would still manage to find me. I could keep running, but that's all I could do. I could not hide from this man. The most chilling part is that after many failed attempts at escaping, without my dream changing or ending, I gave up on running. As he caught me, he half smiled an emotionless smile, grabbed his scalpel, and I can still remember the cold blade running across my neck. I felt calm and peaceful in comparison to the terror I had experienced for what felt like hours. I felt my neck and saw my own blood covering my hands. I remember closing my eyes, and in the next moment I was awake, in a state of panic with a cold sweat. I realized that I had a lucid dream where I was killed. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night after that. I have never really had anything actually scary happen to me. Awkward moments, sure. People being outright mean, that too. But never anything legit scary. But all that changed just a few weeks before lockdown, when I was asked to babysit a neighbor's kid while they went to a party relating to one of their jobs. I had never ever babysat for anyone before, so admittedly, I was pretty nervous. But if I had known what kind of night I had in store for me, I'd have turned the job down in a second. It was made all the worse by the fact that my parents pretty much assured me that it would be an easy $50 and that the night would be over before I knew it. I had a bad feeling about the whole thing from the start, but my dad actually managed to talk me out of that headspace. Now I wish I had just trusted my gut and stayed well away. So I wander over to the house around 7 in the evening, introducing myself to the parents and the kid before they go over a few ground rules. At first, it seemed like my dad was right, that I was just being silly, and that if I played my cards right, I could turn this into a regular thing to fund my weekend shopping habits. The parents were lovely, and so was the kid, so I got pretty chill pretty quickly, and ended up sort of enjoying myself, entertaining the kid after they left with the help of Disney Plus, which I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a huge fan of. Everything is going well until it comes time to put the kid to bed. Then, things started getting a little awkward. The kid straight up refuses, and our new, happy little friendship starts to quickly deteriorate. I felt super mean having to lay down the law with the kid, and he went from crying and wailing to shouting and screaming at me like I wasn't his mom, he hated me, and I didn't belong there. Stuff like that. It actually kinda hurt, and I started to realize that maybe I wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility yet. To be a parent or a guardian, you need to be tough enough to be able to kind of be the bad guy, if that makes any sense. And if there are any of you out there that are looking to get into babysitting, thinking it'll be easy money, please reconsider. I have done way easier things for money before and since. Things that don't make you feel crappy for having to shout at a kid. But after a while, the whole temper tantrum seems to have tired the kid out. And even though he still seemed upset with me, he went up to his room, got into his pajamas, and climbed into his bed to sleep. He asked me to read him a story, and since he had actually done as he was told, I obliged. And when his eyes finally closed over and his breathing slowed, I snuck out of the room and downstairs to leave him to get some rest. So about an hour or so later, I was sitting on the couch texting a friend of mine, telling them how babysitting was way harder than I thought it was going to be. I'm working through the leftover chicken pot pie that my mom had given me to take over there, catching up on some episodes of The Mandalorian, when the family house phone starts to ring. Thinking it was the parents looking to check up on me, I pick up, greeting the caller in the cheeriest voice I could manage. Only, no one on the other end responds. I say, "Hello," a few more times, assume it's a butt dial or a bad line, and I hang up, heading back to finish off my meal. No sooner am I sat down again, the phone rings again. I was kind of expecting it, I suppose. Maybe the parents had gone through a tunnel or something, I don't know. But either way, I get up again, head over to the phone, and pick up. Only this time, when I do, I can hear breathing on the other end of the phone. I give another cheery hello, but there's just the same breathing coming from the other end. When the person finally speaks, it's this super deep voice, obviously a guy, telling me to check on the sleeping kid. I thought it might have been the kid's dad playing a prank, but there was also something really weird and distorted about the voice. I respond like, "Okay, I'll go check," and the line goes dead immediately. The kid is fine, sleeping like a rock, so as much as I'm kinda creeped out by the weird voice, I figure it must have been the dad. Maybe the parents had argued. I don't know. I tried not to think so much about it. But then pretty much as soon as I'm back downstairs, the phone rings again. No caller ID, no nothing. So I answer, unable to prevent this fear from entering my voice. Big mistake. Whoever is calling senses this and starts to giggle down the phone line in that same weirdly distorted voice. What they said next made my blood turn to ice. "Gonna snatch him up. Gonna snatch up the kitty when you're not looking. Gonna get him." I went silent, just totally silent out of fear, and that's when I heard a creak in the floorboards above me. Someone was moving around in the rooms upstairs. I pretty much drop the phone and bolt upstairs and into the kid's room to find that he's still asleep. Or rather, that he very much appears to be asleep. But that same deep, slow breathing isn't there. The more I look, the more like he seems like he's almost holding his breath. Not only that, but his arm is at this weird angle that makes it look like he's holding onto something under his pillow. Something he's trying to hide. In a fury, I pull the pillow up slightly, and then realize what's been happening. Whoever thought it was a good idea to buy an 8-year-old kid a phone is straight up crazy. But under that pillow wasn't just a phone. There was some kind of voice changer under there too. I grab both and run out of the room, back downstairs, where the kid starts throwing another temper tantrum. I felt so dumb, completely played by the kid, made to feel terrified and vulnerable. How the heck could someone be so young, yet so malicious and mean-spirited? The parents arrived back shortly afterward, and I didn't mention a word of what happened until they had paid me in full. Then I read them the riot act. I was never going to babysit for them, and they were completely irresponsible, letting their kid have things like a phone, let alone an actual voice changer. Turns out the creepy little gadget was their older, college-aged kids, and that the little guy was fascinated with it and wouldn't give it back to him. But I didn't care. I wasn't about to put myself out there like that, ever again. This took place a few years ago in a little English town. Me and my friends had been out in the town, and I think we may have been out to see a movie or something. We were walking back to my friend's house, a walk I had walked many times before, when we got to this church. We were being rowdy and having a good time, when all of a sudden we heard a gut-wrenching scream. At first we thought it was coming from across the road, where an abandoned building was. The screams continued, and after a few seconds we realized that they were coming from behind us, in the church. We thought that it could possibly be a few kids messing around, but either way, our curiosity got the better of us. We walked into the yard to try and pin down the location of the screams. It's safe to say at this point we were freaked out. The screams honestly sounded like someone being murdered. I got out my phone at this point and called the police. All the while the screams were continuing, getting louder the closer we approached the church. The police were asking for our location, what we were hearing, trying to keep us calm. My friends were losing it. It was then that the lights of the church illuminated the graveyard. We ducked to avoid the lights, hiding behind headstones. Then, just as suddenly as they came on, they went off again. Then on, then off, then on, and off once more. At that point, we hightailed it out of there. We weren't sticking around to find out what was going on. The police called me back a few minutes later when we were further down the road. They said that they arrived at the church and looked around. However, they couldn't see or hear anything. I asked whether the lights were on or any doors were unlocked, but they said the entire property was fully sealed and no lights were on. To this day, I have no idea what took place that night. In all honesty, I had forgotten about it until my friend had reminded me. We all kind of wrote it off as a weird experience, but there was something about those screams that still, even to this very day, makes me feel uneasy. Back during the summer of 2011, a few friends and I decided to organize a little camping trip to a forest just a few miles outside our hometown. Delamere Forest, despite being pretty small, presented us with a much-needed opportunity to connect with nature. City living can be good, but it can be stifling, so any chance to get out into the countryside was well received. But as time went by, and the date of the camping trip approached, things began to unravel. One by one, various friends called and texted to inform us that they wouldn't be attending, be it family illness, lack of cash, or just laziness. In the end, there was only 2 of us that actually decided to go. So, Early on sunny summer morning, we boarded a train for the journey down to the forest. The weather was perfect. A cloudless sky with a light breeze that made the hike through the woods not nearly as oppressive as we were expecting. It didn't take long for us to find a decent spot in the shade that happened to be right next to a stream that we could use for washing and drinking water. The only trouble was the spot was very open, visible to passerby, and not the least bit subtle. So it's late afternoon, we are tired from our hike, and we decide to build a fire to cook some dinner on. But here's the thing. Building a small fire is an essential part of camping, sure, but it attracts people. The smell of burning wood and the cooking food, the smoke. Sometimes you might as well be announcing yourself to the whole forest with a megaphone. But we know this, so we're not exactly surprised when a group of locals stumbles across our little camp and comes down to say hello. They seem friendly enough at first, and this might sound paranoid, but the whole time, I just had this bad feeling about them. It fascinates me how human instinct can pick up things like that. Little clues in body language or speech that lead to us to believe that someone isn't being entirely genuine. I wasn't sure if it was the way the locals were looking at each other, or the strange, probing questions they asked, but I knew they didn't have the best of intentions. When they moved on and were out of earshot, my friend suggested that we move the camp. Now he's normally the skittish one, who I'm perennially telling to calm down or chill out, but on this occasion, I knew he was right. Maybe we were being a little bit paranoid, but in instances such as that, it's always better to be safe than sorry. So as tired and half drunk as we were, we packed up our stuff, doused the fire, and then started looking for another place to set up camp. Luckily, we found somewhere pretty quick. A heavily wooded hill that basically overlooked our old campsite on one side. Not that we had a direct view of it, but if you walked a minute or so away from camp, we had a pretty good view of the surrounding area. At least, we did during the daytime. As the sun set, we started another fire, cooked ourselves up some ramen noodles in our mess tins, then proceeded to drink and smoke ourselves stupid. We talked about stuff around the fire until we were too tired to drink and continue, then retired to our poncho shelters for the night. I'm pretty sure I passed out as soon as I got into my sleeping bag, as I don't remember drifting off or anything. I just know the next thing I can recall is opening my eyes in pitch darkness to the sound of a distant car revving its engine. At first I was just annoyed to be woken up. The hangover was kicking in hard, and I felt like boiled crap as I tried to fall back asleep. But the distant vehicle kept revving its engine, and as the sound grew louder and louder, I knew it was getting closer. Something told me to go check it out by the time I started to hear voices. It might have just been a bunch of kids taking a stolen car for a spin, but like I said, sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. But when I go to the edge of the hill, I can already see torch beams all over our old campsite. The revving engine was from a vehicle that had been driven all the way down the forest path to our previous camp. Someone was down there, looking for us. I think I acted more out of instinct than anything else, moving as quickly and quietly as I could, back to my sleeping friend, to wake him. I must have explained what I had seen like 2 or 3 times. He was just as exhausted and half drunk as I was, but when it sank in, he was up on his feet with me and helping to kick dirt on our dying fire. We then grabbed a pair of binoculars we were carrying with us and then ran back to the edge of the hill to watch the scene below. In utter horror, we could see what was in the men's hands, thanks to the torches they shone on one another. Baseball bats, hammers, and a length of rope were just a few of the things they carried. They spat and cursed, furious that they had come back too late to catch us. All we had were our Swiss Army knives to defend ourselves with. If the guys down there had decided to actually search the area, they'd have found us pretty easily, and I'm not sure I'd be here telling this story today. But to our infinite fortune, they didn't. Maybe they had been drinking themselves, or were just too lazy to actually look for us, but we are so thankful they didn't. With one person keeping watch, the other went back to camp to pack their gear as fast as they could. The guys down below were hanging around our old camp, kicking at the fire we had so carefully constructed, taking all their spite out on things we had left behind. As I've mentioned, they didn't seem keen on actually looking for us, but they didn't seem like they were in a hurry to leave either. This meant that we were essentially stuck on this wooded hill, as an escape attempt with our heavy packs meant that if we were discovered, there would be no outrunning any of them, especially since they had a vehicle. We ended up staying there until morning. Neither of us could get any sleep despite the gang leaving with their vehicle. I remember being terrified they would return one more time, more torches, more people, with more of a will to find us. But they didn't. They were probably sleeping off their own hangovers by the time that we were on the train home. We were due to stay another 2 nights, and I was still annoyed that we had to call the trip short. But with those scummy local people around, we just didn't want to risk it. Be careful when you're traveling around, whether it is internationally or locally, because despite the unfathomable kindness of strangers, some of them aren't so friendly.
So, this is a story from my brother. As such, I have no way of validating that this happened at all, except one part that I'll get to later. Back in 2015, my brother worked for a security guard hiring place, not exactly sure what to call it. Basically, he'd call and they'd station him someplace or another that needed it. So this particular time, my brother got hired by the local cemetery. They'd had issues with kids sneaking in at night and messing things up. And at one point, they even broke a couple of graves. Well, his job was to drive around the cemetery and make sure no one was messing around. This area was pretty rural at the time, and had a pretty bad stray dog problem. Dogs would often get lost around here, or people would drop them off, and they'd form packs and roam the countryside. On this particular night, my brother was at the cemetery. He noticed a pretty big pack of dogs, about 8 or so, just wandering around and playing. There was a big Rottweiler, important later, a couple of mixed-breed dogs, and even a little Bichon Frise that was clearly someone's pet at some point, because it still had a harness on. So my brother is doing his rounds, which, like I said, was basically to drive from one end of the cemetery to the other, with a spotlight, and to make sure no kids were breaking in, doing things they weren't supposed to in one of the mausoleums or something. He was driving real slow, and had the window down, his arm out the window with the spotlight, and it's pitch black at this point. Suddenly, he hears dogs going crazy, but then he hears what he can best describe as a sound like a screaming bird from the swamp episode of Avatar, but deeper and more human, with a rattling sound mixed in, like a rattlesnake's rattle. The dogs go silent before starting to back up, barking and snarling a few minutes later. Then something fast and pale runs in front of his headlights, with the 8 dogs in pursuit, barking and snarling. So he decides to follow the dogs, in fear that they're getting ready to tear someone's pet apart. He parks his car, gets out with his spotlight, then follows the sound of barking. But then he hears that scream again. He swears that he heard a faint mixed in with the weird screech and rattling. He gets to where the dogs are going nuts and shines his light at the spot. He's now surprised to see that the dogs have a deer backed up against the wall of a mausoleum. He said that this deer was a pale gray color. It was skinny and emaciated. He shined the light at its eyes. They were solid black, yet somehow no light reflected back. He said they were like the eyes of something dead. He is understandably confused, and he's standing there, a few yards away from a pack of angry, snarling dogs that haven't even registered that he's there. The dogs have this deer surrounded and are taking turns nipping at its hind end and legs. But my brother notices that every time they do, they recoil and sort of gag, as if the taste is appalling to them. My brother then hears a deep growling coming from behind him, and this big Rottweiler bowls past him, launching itself at this deer. It grabs at the deer's hind leg, and with a mighty shake, knocks the thing over and just starts wailing on it. My brother then says the deer lets out that screech again. He watched as the deer took its hoof and begins to swipe, yes, swipe, at the dogs. The Rottweiler lets go, and the deer takes off, dogs hard on its heels. He never did guard work at that cemetery again, but he did get me to go back to the cemetery with him a few days later. That little Bichon Frise with the harness was there, and we managed to get it to come with us. And now he's had that dog for the last 5 years. I was 7 years old. I was in the car with my mother and my brother, who was 3 years older than me. I can't recall much of the specifics, but I do know we were on our way to a beach in Texas, all the way from our home in Oklahoma. It would be a long ride, but it gave me a chance to play some Mario on my Game Boy Advance. Well into our journey, maybe 4 or 5 hours down the road, my mother pulled us into a rest stop for an emergency bathroom visit. I didn't really need to go, but both my mother and brother could not wait any longer. My mom was even so desperate to go to the bathroom that she asked me permission first, as she didn't want to leave me in the car for very long. I just nodded and said, "It's okay," and the two of them took off. I think they were only gone for a few minutes. It was sundown, and there were no other cars in the lot. Given that situation, I can't really blame my mom for running off to the bathroom. So while they did their business, I sat there struggling to get the last bits of sunlight to hit my Game Boy Advance screen. Before I realized how hopeless the cause was, a sudden sound from behind me caused me to jump. It was the sound of the trunk to my mother's SUV opening up, then quickly shutting. Seemingly automatically, I turned my head to see who had opened the trunk. What I saw when I turned my head was nothing, but I did hear something stirring around in the seat and in the floor. I began to unfasten my seatbelt so that I could stand up and get a good look at what was in the back seat. Whatever it was had managed to close the trunk behind it. It couldn't have been an animal, so I thought it was my brother crawling back there to find something or even to scare me. The moment I began to tinker with my seatbelt, a voice whispered from behind me, "Stay put." Something had told me to stay put, just as a child would do. Nonsensically and reflexively, I replied with, "Why?" It didn't take long for the thing to respond. "You'll get into trouble." Well, they did have a point. If I started climbing over the seat or getting out to go to the trunk, my mom would be mad. She would want me to stay put, to stay safe. So I listened and let go of my seatbelt. "Okay, who are you?" I asked. "Starving." I think it said starving. I suddenly felt bad. Sure, I wanted to see who was in the car with me, but I was an easily distracted kid, and a compassionate one at that. "Oh, I know." I leaned forward, stretching out my little arm and grabbing my baby bottle pop that my mom had gotten me at the last gas station. I unscrewed the top, then dipped it into the little cup, covering the hard candy part in powder. I remember thinking how much my little friend in the back was going to love this, because baby bottle pops were my favorite candy. I then turned around, trying to reach my hand over the back of the seat so my friend could have some candy. But my arm wasn't long enough, and they didn't want me out of my seatbelt, so I wasn't sure at first how to get my candy to the back seat. I peered down and to the left, I was facing the middle seat in the middle row of the SUV, the spot we never used or sat on. It was then that I looked through the opening between the seats, and I found an eye looking back at me, never blinking. A dark black eye. I couldn't find pupils in those eyes. The skin around them was sunken in and extremely pale. Reminded me of my older brother when he stays inside all summer playing video games. But this was much worse. As I recall it now, so many years later, I swear I could see veins throbbing under the skin. After I was done observing my friend, who was apparently lying on the back floorboard, I began to stick my hand with the baby bottle pop in it, through the crack, towards my friend. The opening was big enough that I could still see what my friend was doing. He began to open what appeared to be his mouth. The way that mouth looked to me, it terrified me even then, shoving all my innocence and trust and carefree attitude to the side. I was overwhelmed with horror in that moment, because I had never seen teeth so sharp or so numerous in a person's mouth. The teeth were yellowed and disgusting to look at, broad at the roots and thinned out at the top, looking more like fat daggers than anything else. I stopped reaching forward with my candy when I saw that, and at that age I didn't have the foresight to pull my hand back. I watched as this mouth approached my hand. My young mind was filled with thoughts about how much this was going to hurt. A kid should never be put in that situation. Suddenly, the door beside me opened. "What are you looking at, you goob?" My older brother climbed back into his seat on the opposite side of the middle row. My mom was entering the car too, beginning to sit down and buckle up in the front seat. In that instant, I had yanked my hand out from the crack, and all I could do was stare at my brother, shaking my head over and over. "Okay." My brother smirked, obviously confused at my reaction. My head shot forward and I stared at the seat in front of me. My little heart was pounding when I looked down at my feet, which were hanging several inches above the floor. I was a short kid after all. I saw that they were shaking. Remembering that you can climb under these seats to get to the back, I yanked my legs up onto the seat. "Honey, no feet in the seat, please." My mother reprimanded me, her eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror. I whimpered out, My legs hurt." As she pulled into reverse, she sighed, then relented. "All right, just take your shoes off at least, okay? I know you were splashing in the mud before we left, and I don't want the seats all dirty." I was so relieved. I quickly threw my shoes off. They fell to the floor below me. We took off back down the highway. My brother soon fell asleep, and my mom was solely focused on the road. I was insanely tired, but I didn't want to shut my eyes long. After all, my friend was still in the car. At one point I did glance towards the opening in the seats, but I did not see his face. Only when I felt a breathing on my right elbow did I know where my friend was. He was crouched in the floor right behind me. I knew if I looked through the opening to my right, between the wall of the interior of the SUV and my seat, I would see his eyes and maybe even his mouth. So once again, I looked straight ahead, and I didn't turn for a while. For the next hour, I distracted myself from my new companion by wondering how I could get my mother's attention, to make her aware of this thing in the back seat, to make everything better without risking any of us getting hurt. But I was too panicked, too nervous, too little to think of anything at all. Suddenly, I saw movement below me. In the floor just in front of me, my shoes were moving. It took me a few seconds to see through the dark that there was a long and thin finger in each of my shoes, pulling them under the seat into the back seat behind me. I was trembling again. Once I could no longer see the shoes, I heard a sniffing sound, followed by a voice.
child's flavor.
At first, I couldn't understand what he said, but then it came to me. Child's flavor. Suddenly, there was a sharp sting in my right arm. I yanked away and looked over, only to find a bony hand with long, pale, and sharp fingers had been poking into me. The last thing I heard him say was this.
Next, stop.
That one was clearer. Next, stop. My young self could no longer contain or cope with the amount of terror that I was feeling. I screamed so loud and so suddenly, my mom nearly wrecked. She slammed on the brakes, turning the steering wheel to the right, trying to maintain control of the now sliding vehicle. She managed to realign the car with the road, but not before the man in the truck behind us plowed into the back of the SUV, because we had slowed down so suddenly and so quickly. When we came to a complete stop, my mom spun around in her seat to look at me. I was in tears and holding my arm still from the sharp finger. I could tell she was furious at first, but seeing me so scared and thinking I'd hurt my arm in the wreck, she donned an expression of concern. She threw off her seatbelt, opened the door, then ran over to my side. She opened my door and tried to ask me if I was okay and look me over. But all of that was interrupted when a sickeningly pale and thin figure crawled and threw itself from the back seat. My friend flew past us. It was out the door, past my mom, and scurrying away through the trees near the road in a matter of seconds. What the? My mother cursed in front of me. She held her hand to her heart, obviously as surprised as I was. The man who had hit our car from behind had already gotten out of his truck and was approaching my mom to see if we were okay. Luckily, he wasn't mad. He was close enough to see something fly out of the car. He ran up to my mom and asked if she needed help getting her dog back. I remember this part extremely clearly. She looked at the man and replied, "We don't have a dog." My mother truthfully admitted fault in the accident, explaining to the man that I had screamed in my seat, causing her to freak out. The man was understanding and patient. They traded information, reported it to a police officer, and before long we were on our way. We made it to our destination in Texas just fine, and the trip back was uneventful, thank God. Though my mother would ask me from time to time if I remembered what was in the back seat. And as a kid, I would just shrug. I would respond, "I don't know," because I really didn't. I've talked about this with my mom now that I'm older. I've told her the whole truth, the whole thing, what I'm telling you now. But I'm not sure she believes me. She thinks I was just scared that a wild animal crawled into the car, that my memories are fuzzy and I'm trying to piece things together to make sense of how scared I was back then. And you know what? She's wrong. Though I wish she was right, I remember it all too clearly. Now I know when I'm a dad, I won't be leaving my kids alone in the car for even a second. At least until they can drive. It was the summer of the year 2000. My family moved into a rural area that was just starting to sprout developments. We lived among a few horse farms and ranches that bordered a brand new gated community. The back wall of it ran along the front of ours and our neighbor's property. So it was an odd mix of country folk and urbanites. 2 properties over, a park had been built with a playground, hockey rink, picnic shelters, restrooms, and a 1/4 mile of paved jogging path that wound through the tree line of a dense stand of woods, which itself ran along the back border of the park. There was a massive field between the playground and tree line, where we could run around. There was also a gate built into the back wall of the subdivision that would allow those kids to come play at the park. Things were always a little spooky around here, The farms and ranches had been there since the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was an active area during the Seminole Wars in Florida. You'd see things in the tree line sometimes, or you would feel something otherworldly pressing on your consciousness even during the day if you wandered too deep into those woods. The real troubles didn't start until the grave was found. One of the local boys that lived up the dirt road from us had wandered too deep into the woods behind the park. He came to an old barbed wire fence, so he jumped it and found the ruins of a barn hidden in a tree-ringed clearing that had nearly been swallowed by undergrowth. It was there that the grave of a lost settler was found. This man had sent his family to a nearby fort when the threat of Seminole raiding parties loomed. He and the other men fought back, but were slaughtered. The men who buried him were killed, so the location of his grave marker was lost for over a century. The finding of the grave was a big enough deal to make the local papers, with a photo of the headstone and the boy who found it published on the front pages. It wasn't long before the grave was desecrated by local vandals, and things escalated. First came the snakes. We went from seeing a couple of black racers and rat snakes a year to half a dozen venomous cottonmouths in a month. Then the crows came, screaming every morning from their murders, high up in the trees or on the power lines. It wasn't just them animals. The entire mood of the area seemed to shift. An early chill came in September, and we started having heavy mist almost every night and morning that would blanket everything. The mist would hang onto the tree line as the sun burned it away, lasting nearly until noon, obscuring the woods within its embrace. Sometimes I would see things moving in the mist, usually the silhouette of a large, dog-like thing. In my 11-year-old mind, it was large enough to be a wolf. It would still from tree to tree, its large head low to the ground as though sniffing for a scent. Weeks passed, and the foreboding grew. It got to a point where kids stopped playing at the park altogether. My cousins and their family lived with us at the time. We had a double-wide trailer being placed on the back of our acreage for them, and they were living in the main house until it was done being hooked up to power, water, and septic. One night, the eldest cousin, who shared a room with my older brother, got fed up with my brother staying up late to play his new PS1, so he decided to go to sleep in the trailer. They were pretty much moved in, but there was still no power or water hooked up. He gathered his pillows and blankets and made the trip through the darkness to the back of the acre. He was startled by a black cat that darted from under one of our sheds and ran across his path. He was spooked, but decided to keep going. He made it to the trailer and locked it behind him, then made his way to what would be his shared room. He climbed into the top bunk and settled in. A few minutes later, he heard slow and heavy footsteps heading towards his room at the end of the trailer. As they neared, he pulled his blanket over his head and was peeking from under it. He said he could see the top of the door of the room. It swung open, and he said he could feel something lean into the room. After a minute or two, this presence left, and he eventually fell asleep. A few weeks after that, my parents had some church friends over for a coffee and cake. 2 girls came with them, and they really wanted to go play manhunt at the park. I didn't want to go, but I was overruled by the older kids, and off we went with flashlights. I was uneasy at first, but we made the woods out of bounds, and that made me feel a bit better. We played a few rounds, and I began having a lot of fun. The moon was out full and bright. During the final round, I was hiding under a picnic table, facing the expansive field and tree line. I glanced around, and I spotted a dark mass crouched on the jogging path, right where it entered a small stand of pine trees. The mist was already setting in, so it was obscured. I continued to stare at it when it stood up. I don't know if it was the fear I felt, but as I remember it, it was nearly half as tall as the pine trees it stood among, which at the time would be nearly 7 feet. I jumped as one of the girls screamed from nearby. My brother and cousins came running to see what happened, but it turned out she had been tagged and was being dramatic. I looked back to the tree line just in time to see the tall thing enter the woods. I told them about what I saw, and they dismissed it as one of the people from the neighborhood. We decided to end the round and sit down in the field next to the hockey rink, which was fenced in with a tall chain-link fence to keep errant pucks or balls from injuring non-players. We sat in a semicircle with our back to the woods. My older cousin faced us and began telling ghost stories, the one I mentioned earlier in the trailer. Halfway through the story, he just freezes and stares over our heads, then jumps up and takes off without a word. We all look back and see a 7-foot-tall shadow thing or man coming towards us out of the mist and shrouded woods. I say shadow because it was close enough that we would have been able to make out facial features and clothing if it were an actual person. But there were no features. It was just black, tall, and menacing. We all got up and sprinted after my cousin into the hockey rink. We formed a circle with our backs to one another and all stared into the growing mist. The shadow thing was gone. One of the girls was sobbing, while the rest of us panted in fear. We were there for maybe 10 minutes before any of us could muster the will to move or speak, and we realized we had left our flashlights in the middle of the field. We decided to stay in a circle and walk the quarter-mile back to our house that way. We made it halfway through the park when one of the girls broke the circle and ran. We all screamed and did the same, sprinting down the dirt road until we made it back to the house, where we told our parents what happened. The 3 dads went back to the park, armed and cautious, thinking it was a kid or an adult from the community playing a prank on us 11 to 14-year-olds. They came back maybe 45 minutes later with our flashlights, along with puzzled looks on their faces. They had not found anyone, but all 5 of our flashlights were dead. We moved to a different city not long after, but that shadow has stayed in my memory and dreams for the last 22 years. I don't know if it was the spirit of the murdered settler, or one of the Seminole that had died there too. All I know is that it was not a person. My father's grandmother once told him a story of a man from the 1900s in Mexico that had a very heart-stopping experience. Said man, let's call him Jose, a very common Mexican name, loved to drink. So he and one of his friends are finishing drinking at a local bar one night. When they leave the bar, they say their goodbyes and go their separate ways for the evening. As I stated before, it's Mexico in the 1900s. For most people, you either traveled by your own 2 feet or by horse. Luckily for Jose, he had a horse. So off he went, back to his home late at night, taking the dirt trails. Along the way, he passes under a bridge. As he comes out the other side, he begins to hear what sounds like a child crying. He stops and gets off his horse. He looks in the direction of the crying. He soon finds the source of the crying. It's a little boy crying all alone. He asks the child if he's all right.
I'm lost. Can you help me?
Jose, of course, agrees to help the little boy, so he picks him up and places him on the rear of the saddle. He gets back on, and then they're on their way. As they travel along, Jose feels the little kid poke his back a few times. So Jose asks what's the matter. The young boy responds,
Daddy, look.
grill teeth.
When Jose looks back, he's face to face with a horrifying sight. What was once a little boy now sat a dark figure with rows of sharp, long white teeth, smiling at him, with a pair of eyes that radiated death itself. Turning white with fear, Jose's only reaction was to pull back the reins of the horse, which causes the horse to fall backwards. Luckily, he didn't get caught in the middle and just fell off the back. Jose wasted no time getting up and looking for his horse, but unfortunately the horse had been spooked and ran off into the night. Jose proceeded to do the same and hightail it out of there, not even daring to test his luck. He didn't look back. The following day, when his friend asked to go for some drinks, he said only a little, because he didn't want to stay too late.
My sister and I slept in the same bedroom. She's 2 years younger than me. Our beds were pretty much next to each other. Next to my sister's bed was a tall wardrobe. Not a spooky one, just a white box from IKEA. It was attached to the wall and filled with our old toys. One night, I woke up to my sister sitting on her bed, mumbling quietly. She's done this before, but this time she was facing the wardrobe, so I only saw her back. I sat up quickly, remembering the previous time this had happened. I felt super uneasy. I didn't feel like somebody was in the room. I couldn't sense anything around us. I just felt scared. What I hadn't realized immediately was that my sister wasn't just facing the wardrobe, that the door was actually open. Not just a little bit, like I took something during the day and didn't notice that I left it open a crack, but it had been clearly opened during the night. We never go to that wardrobe since there's just a ton of old toys in there, nothing that we actually need. Instead of asking who she was talking to or what she was talking about, I decided to just listen. Or maybe I was too afraid to ask. I honestly can't remember. At first I only heard mumbling and I couldn't make out anything. But then I heard her clearly ask, "What did you want to tell me?" while looking into the wardrobe. And when I shifted a little bit in my bed to look, that's when I got this overwhelming feeling of someone being in the room with us. I called my sister's name and I noticed her stiffening from hearing my voice, but she didn't turn around to face me before quietly mumbling, "I have to go," and closing the door of the closet. After that, she seemed way sleepier, way less aware of her surroundings, like she was still asleep. But the way that she just spoke a little bit earlier and closed the door was like a completely coherent person. She seemed to be fully awake, not like she was still asleep. She fell asleep right after I told her to lay her head on the pillow and get some sleep. And once again, like the last time, she couldn't remember any of this the next morning. After the previous time, the feeling of the unsafe and dark presence disappeared. But after this time, it stayed. Every day, in every room, it felt like someone was looking at you or sitting in the shadows. It sounds spooky, but it felt even spookier. I feel like usually home is your safe place, but during that time, it felt like everything but safe and cozy. My mom experienced super vivid bad dreams. Never before had she believed us, or in any sort of presences or ghosts, or had she ever been spooked out by those things. I struggled with severe insomnia, but my little sister, she slept like a baby. Around a month after the wardrobe incident, I woke up again to the same setting, and this time I just started crying immediately from how freaked out I was. My sister was once again sitting on her bed, facing the wardrobe with her back turned towards me. This time the door was closed, but she was tapping the same door with her fingernail. Not once or twice, but continuously, while mumbling quietly. This time I immediately told her to stop and get back to bed. She put her hand down and kept mumbling, but kept facing the wardrobe. I called her name calmly again for a couple of times before she finally turned to me with her eyes closed and said, "I can't do it." I asked what she couldn't do, but then she just laid down and fell asleep. After this night, the bad energy or presence I had felt disappeared, and slowly my mom's nightmares and my insomnia left too. I still don't know what the heck was going on, but honestly, I'm just glad it stopped. I moved out about a year after that, and now my sister has her own room, so there's no telling if stuff like this keeps happening or not. But there are still times when I visit my mom's place and feel the same feeling of unsafe, especially during the night. This is a story that I've carried with me for the last 24 years. I haven't really spoken much about it since I was a child. You're free to not believe me. In fact, I encourage you to doubt anything that you're told from anybody. I'm writing this because as I've gotten older and I've spent over 2 decades developing a life to the best of my ability, I've carried an immense weight on my shoulders that nothing seems to alleviate. So I thought maybe telling my story would help. I am not from here, and by here, I don't mean where I currently live. I don't mean where any of us live. Anyone who is hearing this right now, it's now a few days after my 30th birthday, and this time of year always strikes me, because I started kindergarten on my birthday when I turned 5. I thought, at the time, that everyone did that. You turned 5, and when you turned 5, you went to school. I didn't realize that my birthday just happened to coincide with the first day of school. A little over 1 year later, in about 2 weeks' time, it will have been 24 years to the day that my entire world vanished. I was born in San Diego, and I lived in a poorer suburb of San Diego as a child. I lived in an apartment complex called Lemon Vine Apartments. They were a bit slummier versions of the Lemon Vine apartments found in Lemon Grove, which is a suburb of San Diego. My parents were divorced but friendly. My mother was young when she had me, and she was beautiful. She was in her early 20s and was aspiring to be a model. She would regularly take trips to LA to do photo shoots. She did glamour modeling for magazines. She had a darker skin tone, being 1/4 Indian, and it gave her an exotic look. My favorite picture of her as a child was her modeling a luxurious wedding dress for a bridal company. I used to sleep with that picture when she would go to LA, and I would stay with my dad, who worked for the city of San Diego. They shared custody pretty evenly, and we even did Christmas together as a family, even though they had split when I was still a baby. My dad, his girlfriend, my mom, who was single, and me. Maybe things weren't as good between them as I remember, but I was 6, so if there was drama behind the scenes, they did a really good job of hiding it from me. On September 17th, 1996, I was staying with my dad's parents in Riverside, California. They had a small farm where they raised chickens, pigs, and goats. No horses or sheep or anything. But my grandma had several pet ducks that would eat from your hands, fly away, and return every year like clockwork. My dad had to work at night for a week, and my mom was in LA, so I stayed with my grandparents. Schools back then were pretty cool with this kind of thing, and I was sent home with the sorts of nonsense assignments that you would expect of a first grader who had just gone back to school after summer break ended. The 17th was the 3rd day that I was staying with my grandparents, and my grandpa had told me to be careful outside because he'd seen a rattlesnake and wasn't sure where it had gone. So, since nobody knew where the mystery snake had gone off to, 6-year-old me decided to go hunting for it. In hindsight, letting a 6-year-old go looking around a farm for a rattlesnake was probably not in any Parenting 101 handbook, but this was the 90s, and I guess they didn't actually expect me to find it. There were woods on the property, but I wasn't allowed to go in there, so they probably figured that's where the snake had gone off to. I spent all day outside playing jungle exploration on the farm, trying to track down this snake. And, much to my excitement, when I decided to open the well house, there it was. Curled up, rattling away. I immediately slammed the door shut and ran to my grandparents' house to tell them that I'd found it. Now, this might be my 6-year-old memory exaggerating, but I'm pretty sure that snake was like 900 feet long, give or take. I found it, though. I was excited to tell my grandpa that I had found it so he could do what he did, go out and shoot the thing. I ran in the back door of the house, which leads you into the laundry room and through the kitchen. I paid no mind to anything until I turned left and entered the living room, expecting to see my grandparents, my uncle, and the neighbor couple, all sat in the living room where I'd left them. Except they weren't there, and it wasn't the same living room anymore. The furniture was completely wrong. The hard and memorably uncomfortable hardwood furniture my grandpa loved so much was gone. The coffee table that he had made out of a tree stump was gone, replaced by fluffy grandma-looking furniture. A 3-person sofa with a floral design on it. The TV was in the wrong place, newer than my grandpa's old sit-on-the-ground cabinet television. The hardwood paneling on the walls was gone, or at least covered by blue wallpaper. The hardwood floor was a shaggy off-white carpet. The pictures of my dad, my uncle, me, and my grandparents were gone from the walls, replaced by paintings and pictures of people I didn't know. As confused as I was by all of this, I was more confused by the fact that everybody was missing. In my 6-year-old brain, I accepted that they may have completely rearranged the entire house while I'd spent the day looking for a snake, but I didn't believe at all that they would just leave me alone. I didn't see anybody leave. I didn't see the cars go down the road. So I walked out the front door, which was attached to the living room, as they usually are, and I thought that maybe they had gone to the chickens or the pigs. Both should have been clearly visible from the front porch, but the chicken coop was gone, and the pig pen had lost its fencing. There were no pigs to be found. At this point, I was beyond confused, and I was getting very scared. I didn't want to be alone, and I didn't see anybody. Even though they lived on a small farm, the neighbors that had been visiting lived just across the dirt road. So I ran down our dirt driveway and across the road to their house, assuming that must be where everybody had gone. I remember getting more and more scared as I ran to their house, and I remember starting to cry when their house was the wrong color. It wasn't the faded yellow house it used to be. It wasn't even the right house anymore, but nevertheless I banged on the door. I remember that at this point I was crying quite profusely because I didn't understand what was happening, and I kept wiping my face, which covered it in dirt after having been digging around under stumps and logs for snakes all day. When the door opened and a woman in her late 40s or early 50s answered, and I'd never seen her before, I just started bawling uncontrollably. Everything after this point is largely a blur, because nothing was right. I knew where I lived. I knew where I went to school. I knew where my grandparents lived. But I met the people who lived where my grandparents lived, and they were not my grandparents. I didn't know them. I begged for them to get my uncle to tell them who I was, but my uncle wasn't there. Through a series of various police and people in suits, I was brought back to the town that I lived in after what seemed like 10 hours in the local police station trying to contact my parents. I had my home number memorized, but told them that my dad would be asleep. But when they called that number, the person on the other end had no idea who I was or what they were talking about. I was asked to give the police officers my address, and I sat in the local police station while the police in my hometown went there. When they finally called the station back, they were informed that the name of the apartment building was incorrect. Lemon Vine Apartments didn't exist, and the address that I gave them was to an apartment complex called Merritt Manor. The apartment number that I had given them was unoccupied. I believe at this point they were operating under the assumption that I had given them the wrong name of the apartments and the wrong apartment number, but I did in fact live there. When I was finally brought to my hometown after changing hands a couple of times between police, I was asked to give the police officers my address again, and was driven to where I lived. That was it. That was my apartment complex. But just like everything else, it looked wrong. It was painted a different color, and the sign that used to have a large image of a lemon reading Lemon Vine now read Merritt Manor. I took the police to exactly where I lived, and just as they had said, no one lived there. From this point forward, the police attempted to contact neighbors, all of whom knew me, but none of them were who they were supposed to be. Every person who came out of the apartment building was the wrong person, and none of them knew who I was. From this point, they attempted to contact my father, which should have been easy. He worked for the city, but no employee by his name apparently worked there in any capacity. A day turned to night, and I spent endless hours sitting in the police station as they attempted to find any person in the world who knew me. I couldn't do anything but cry and cry, endlessly. A woman in a suit, who I think was either a detective or just somebody who happened to work there, sat with me for several hours and tried to keep me calm. She gave me a stuffed dog, a Dalmatian puppy, that looked a little bit like one of the dogs from 101 Dalmatians. She told me that his name was Sparky, and that I could keep Sparky, and that when they found my parents, Sparky would go home with me and make sure that I never got lost again. She said he was a good dog, and he would protect me if I took care of him. During this time, they attempted to contact my school. I told them I went to Shawnee Elementary. It was easy to find. It was really close to where I lived. But a school by such a name, as you might have guessed by now, didn't exist. My school was apparently called Anza Elementary. At one point, I was asked if the police had ever taken my fingerprints, and they had. In my kindergarten, my entire class had our fingerprints taken by the police at the school gym for basically exactly this reason. Unsurprisingly by now, this didn't help at all. They couldn't find my parents, my grandparents, my neighbors, my apartment, even me. They couldn't even find me. I was too young to remember what my social security number was, but I severely doubt that it would have mattered. They asked my birthday and any relevant information that could help them figure out who I was and where I belonged, but nothing that I told them turned up any information. At some point during the day, I was briefly taken to the ER, as the police suspected I may have sustained some kind of head injury. After being looked over by a doctor, of course, they found nothing wrong with me, and I was sent back to the police station. I ended up staying with somebody that night, but I'm not entirely sure who it was. Someone from Child Services, I imagine. I couldn't stop crying long enough to really focus on what was happening after this point. I had cried myself to sleep several times in the police station, and I cried myself asleep again at the house I stayed at that night, despite the woman that I was staying with doing everything in her power to calm me. This was not the same woman who gave me Sparky. I clung to Sparky so hard I'm surprised I never popped his head off. I didn't have my picture of my mom. I didn't know what was going on, and nobody could find out where I belonged. This didn't make any sense to me. I was only 6, and just barely. I lived where I lived, and my parents were my parents, and my school was my school, but they all just disappeared one day. But they couldn't have, right? In between fits of crying and waking up, I begged to go home. I begged for the lady I was staying with to try and call my dad again. I just kept begging to go back. Over the next few days, I was interrogated and questioned by different people at different times, at different places, at all hours of the day. Police, investigators, people from departments I still don't know the names of, child psychologists, everyone under the sun was asking me questions. I was back and forth between the police station and the house I was staying at, until eventually somebody told me that they thought they had located my parents and that they were coming to get me. Finally, I was going home. Finally, this was all going to be over. Finally, I could get away from these strange people asking me the same questions over and over. When the couple showed up at the police station, though, my heart fell into my feet, as these were not my parents. But they'd had a son that went missing, and I fit his description pretty closely. The woman started crying when she saw me, though, because she immediately knew that I wasn't her missing son. I was out of tears to cry at this point. Eventually, I was collected by Child Services, and I was taken to a foster family where I stayed for a few months. The police launched a campaign asking for anybody to come forward with information about me. They took my picture at the police station for the newspapers to put on the news. I never let go of Sparky, not even for a second. They didn't want me to hold him in the photo because I didn't have him when I arrived, but I needed him, and I would throw an intense tantrum whenever somebody tried to take him away. They had me put back on the clothes I was wearing when they found me, but they had since given me new clothes to wear. In those months I spent at the foster home, parents of missing children would come to the house to see if I was theirs. I didn't realize that this is what was happening until I was older and looked back on it. They didn't just pull me out and say, "Is this your kid?" They were a little bit more subtle about it. The parents would come to meet me, and upon realizing that I was not their missing child, they would often leave in tears. Looking back at all these families that came to see me in desperation that they were going to have their child back, I feel so horrible for them. It's a feeling I can't really explain. Almost like a type of guilt. Almost like I wish I had been their child so they could have them back and know they were safe. Most of those people probably never saw their children again, but I try and imagine that all of them were reunited, even though I know that isn't likely. This guilt was one of the things that kept me in therapy as an adult. But like I said, no therapist has ever bought my story or believed what I've said. The most common belief suggested to me has always been that I was abandoned as a child, I lived in an abusive home, I was dumped on the side of a dirt road in the middle of a farmland, and I repressed all the negative memories I had of my past. I didn't stay in that foster home permanently. Eventually, while my case wasn't officially closed, I needed to start going to school, and I needed identification. I was issued a birth certificate for the date that I told them was my birth year, but the day and month were listed as September 17th, the day that I was found. I never understood why they didn't just use the day and month of my actual birth, but I imagine it was because they didn't actually think that I knew. My name was unchanged. I started going to school sporadically. One of the child psychologists who had seen me recommended that I not be placed back in full curriculum immediately, and suspected that I suffered from some form of PTSD. I was put in the special class and was made to go to school twice a week initially. Eventually I started going to school full-time and changed foster homes a few more times. I really can't say how much time passed before it happened, but eventually I was placed for adoption. I was never actually told that I was up for adoption, so I'm not sure how soon after found it was. But eventually people started coming to meet me again. But these people weren't looking for a missing child. They were looking to adopt one. I definitely did not represent myself as a good candidate. I had a story that nobody believed and could verify. I insisted my parents would eventually find me, and I rarely had a day that I wasn't crying until my eyes burned. This story, sad to say, doesn't have a happy ending. I never saw my parents again, and I was a ward of the state until I was 18, and I went nowhere from there. My teens were filled with delinquency, and I did a brief stint in something similar to juvie that San Diego calls chaparral. I never went to college, and I never really started getting my life together until I was about 24. I've never publicly talked about this before, at least not since I was a child, speaking to everybody who was trying to figure out where I came from. I still have Sparky. He's old and worn, still in one piece, but no longer white. He's now a dark shade of gray. He sits on my dresser and is there, just like he always has been. When I was 14, I had visions from my future. Most of those visions were little things, like a song in the car, me being in class, playing with a pet, what somebody would be wearing, things like that. I had these visions until I was 16, and that's when the worst vision I had took place. I had pictures of myself being killed at my own house by a man wearing a Jason mask. When I had this vision, it started with me being all alone in my house, brushing my hair after taking a shower. I was in pajamas, which were mint with purple dots. And then I saw the man in my backyard's rooftop and ran downstairs to try to get answers on why he'd been following me. When I had this vision, I didn't quite understand that yet. I noticed my dog was in my backyard, and I didn't want him to get killed or something, so I opened the door for him to get inside. The man got there first and quickly reached to the floor and grabbed a machete that my family had near where he landed. I ran to the bathroom on the second floor, but he caught me and stabbed me to death. Like I said, I had this vision when I was 16, so ever since that moment, I started to hide the machete under the stairs instead, letting my dog inside the house and keeping him with me every moment. I wore the pajamas in my vision as little as possible. I locked the 3 doors of my home, front, back, and balcony, whenever I was alone, and if I was incapable of doing it at that moment, I would ask for my parents to lock them before leaving me at home. Remember when I said I asked the man why he'd been following me? Well, apparently, ever since I was around 15, I would see somebody follow me home from school. Other times I would see them hiding in the dark, or watching my home across the street. I told my parents about it, and they contacted the police. Some neighbors backed us up because they had seen him too. About 3 months after my dog died, I stopped doing all of these precautionary things. I was still so scared that it took me that long to realize that now that my dog was dead, my death probably wasn't going to happen, since my dog was an integral part of the vision. About 4 days after I stopped hiding all these things around, the news announced that they had found a killer in our city who was breaking in and using a Jason mask. To this day, I don't understand why I had those visions, but I know that heeding them saved my life. This happened on Monday, February 26th of 2018. It had been a great day on the small island where I live. I'm situated on the Norwegian west coast, which gives us a somewhat warm climate. This winter had been cold, about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, but barely any snow, and it had all melted away anyway. The house we lived in at the time is situated on top of a hill. One neighbor on one side, and another house being built on the side facing my bedroom. Said house usually had floodlights on and is well lit in the dark. There's also a road along the houses, which is also well lit. My children were 12 and 8 at the time, and they were on their winter break from school. We had an active couple of days, and as I was helping out in the local recreational center, which was open to anybody wanting to waste some hours, we spent a lot of time there. The kids also wanted a trip up to the mountains, which was about an hour and a half away, and they wanted to go skiing. I had planned for us to do so the following weekend. So it was about 11:30 p.m. and I was getting ready for bed. I entered my dimly lit bedroom. It was lit only by my alarm clock. It can be manually set to a brightness between 0 and 10, and it was only set to 4, which wasn't very much at all. I looked out my window, and it was snowing. Like, really snowing. I got super happy and immediately looked forward to taking the kids sledging the following day. I also have this habit of being slightly mesmerized by the snow when I look at it fall in the light from the street lamps. So I was dreaming away for about a minute and a half, watching this snow fall outside. It had snowed so much that it measured at least 5 centimeters or about 2 inches. I looked how it had set on the roof of the house and how the car parked outside was covered in snow. Then I remembered that I was on my way to bed and snapped out of it. So I bent down to turn the light on properly, get undressed and climb into bed, and I turned my light back off and looked out the window, only to see that it had stopped snowing. Except it hadn't stopped snowing. It had never snowed at all. There was no snow on the road, the roof, the car, nowhere. Nothing. Just a normal night. Puzzled, I made a quick Snapchat which I sent to my friends who probably thought I was crazy and went to sleep. No snow in the morning when I got up, and we eventually got around to driving to the mountain. This glitch, or whatever it was, has stuck with me. I just don't understand how all of those vivid details of the snow in the lamplight, on the car, how it's set, for a full 90 seconds. How is it all not real? Or was it real? A year and a half later and I still can't explain it. Maybe there's a natural explanation, and if so, I'd love to hear it.